Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 50th edition of the Maine Take. My name is Dana Connors. I am pleased to be the host of this weekly program brought to you every week by the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. And every week, we take a look with the help of our guests at some of the issues, ideas, and initiatives at work in our state, working to improve the lives of Maine people, their livelihood, as well as growing our economy. This week, we're going to take a look back at the legislature. We're going to look at initiative underway in our Chamber of Commerce, but we're also going to be hearing from our friend and editor of Mainebiz, Peter Van Allen. So we have a full show for you today, and I am going to begin with the advocacy team here at the State Chamber of Commerce. I've had them on a number of times, and now we're taking a look back at this session, notwithstanding the fact that about a week from now, this session will hopefully have been completed, with May the 9th being veto day. But for the moment, we're going to take a look back at the session of the pandemic, so-called. So I'm going to begin with Peter and then go to each of them and ask them this question. Share with us how you saw this session as it unfolded, both in terms of policy and later we'll take a look at the process. Peter?
Thanks, Dana. Well, as we all know, but our listeners don't, we're working a lot of net today and talking without, really plotting out our discussion points. And I like that idea. It was a very interesting session. I think I was just writing up my impact story, which is our newsletter piece around the Labor Committee, for example. And what I noticed was most of what the Labor Committee focused on in the second session were the most important issues left over from the first session. And I think that's probably not unusual for all of us. I think we all had that experience, that phenomenon. And yes, there were some important bills and issues that came out of this second session. Obviously the supplemental budget is a big deal, particularly that it was bipartisan. But as is typical with a lot of legislators, they leave the important issues for last. And that means sometimes it's more of a struggle. I think this session, at the end of the day, while we had some issues that we were concerned about as carryover bills, as we call the leftovers, they worked out pretty well for the most part. We were able to negotiate some changes to the bills, which made them more palatable to our members and to the business community at large. That didn't happen all the time, but it never does. So I think overall, it was a pretty good session for the business community, even though it looked like it was going to be a difficult one, certainly in 2021. But I guess those are my initial thoughts real quick. And we go to Ben now.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It was a busy session in my world with the two committees that I cover, both the Energy Utilities Technology Committee and the Environment Natural Resources Committee. At a high level, the Environment Committee had about 12 pieces of legislation that they had public hearings and work sessions on. And then the Energy Utilities and Technology Committee had a far greater workload where they had a lot of bills that were carried over, specifically a lot of concept drafts that were carried over with very little language. And they had about 25 total bills that they had to have public hearings and work sessions on. I think from the business community perspective, some of the most problematic pieces of legislation that we were looking at going into to the second session of the 130th did not pass. It ended up dying and not getting support either in committee or between the two bodies. And I think the legislation that did pass, I think the business community made out okay because we made improvements to a lot of the bills that were being discussed. I think there are still some great concerns about some of the legislation that did pass. But I think the two most prominent areas where there was a lot of discussion in the committee on the environmental front was around the conversation of PFAS, forever chemicals. There were a number of bills that were discussed over the last 3 months, And even going back to the first session of the 130th, there was a lot of legislation aimed at PFAS and how we can, work to address the tragic stories, the emotionally charged stories that you hear from folks that have either been contaminated or had, lost their farmland, had negative health effects. And I fully anticipate that'll be the case moving forward in future legislative sessions. This issue is not going to go away. There's going to be more of a push on the public policy front to get those issues under control. And it's important for the business community to engage because it will have a huge impact on our ability to operate, manufacture products, and still compete in a global economy. And then the other two areas are broadband and the greater conversation over the last couple of years about greater accountability for our two major utilities in Maine. There was a healthy amount of debate about those two issues in the committee, but again, I think at a high level, to Peter's point, some of the issues that we were faced at. That we were looking at the mirror in January that I think caused all of us on this call some heartburn, ended up being okay now that we look back at it. Again, not perfect, but certainly made improvements, and I think the chamber played a huge role in the committee process of making a better legislation for the business community. And I know Linda had her hands full over in the taxation committee this session.
Yeah, in tax, we had our hands full. We did. There was this over the last 2 years, there was an enormous amount of anti-business legislation put forth. I've never seen as much as I have the last 2 years. And we, for all intents and purposes, we really came out ahead for the most part. One bill I think we had problems with, but for the most part, we did very well this session considering what we were up against. In terms of all the anti-business bills. It was very frustrating, dealing with the committee process on Zoom because, you had a lot of amendments that were offered with legislation, in the committee process that we just didn't have a chance to comment on. So we really had to do a lot of work, behind the scenes, action alerts, phone calls, up until they came back in at the very end. It was nail biting for a lot of bills. We had the camp tax bill, the notorious camp tax bill that came forth, would tax second homes in Maine. Bills like that we saw, dark stores bill with an amendment that really we couldn't really live with. Tax havens, some bills were turned into studies like the tax haven bill, the water tax bill. Those bills were turned into studies. I think because they knew a lot of it couldn't be passed, so they you wanted to study the issue. You had a lot of bills like that, but overall, I think we did, exceptionally well considering what we were up against this year.
Pick a couple of issues. You each have touched upon them, and both you, Ben and Linda, but in your opinion, has the pandemic heightened the challenge of this session when it comes to policy? I'm not talking about process, but when it comes to policy, is there a connection? And if so, give a couple examples, if that is the case, of how that would have been, how that played out. Peter, you follow me?
Yeah, I do. Real quickly, it is difficult to separate process from policy, and there will be lasting process issues as we go forward. But from a policy perspective, I think the one policy area that I'll be following that definitely springs out of the pandemic is the paid family medical leave issue. The need for leave in the workplace, the amount of leave that employees requested either before, during, and after the pandemic has sort of, really shined a light on this issue. Other states are working on it. Maine has a commission to develop a paid family medical leave program. There was a bill submitted and enacted this session of resolve that extended the time they have to report back the next legislature until January of next year. In the meantime, we do know that groups like the Maine People's Alliance are actively working on a potential ballot question in this area So this is going, the issue of a paid family medical leave program is not going to go away in Maine. And it will certainly be on the top of public policy issues to be debated and discussed in the 131st legislature in 2023.
Ben?
Yeah, I think, the biggest one in my area is, and I mentioned it briefly, is broadband. The state of Maine, since the beginning of the pandemic, has gotten almost $250 million that has been invested into Maine for broadband expansion from the federal government. As we know, with more and more people relocating to Maine since March of 2020, it's highlighted the need, and I think showcase the urgency of why we need to have affordable, reliable, high-speed internet in all corners of the state. We all know Maine is a very rural state. And as companies have adapted over time to work from home policies that look like they could be here to stay, or at least some type of hybrid model. I know we all have probably experienced at one point in this pandemic where our broadband cut out in the middle of a Zoom meeting. Or I know it happened to me one time before I was about to testify in a public hearing as the legislature shifted to a virtual format, where I was getting ready to testify, and next thing you know, I didn't have Wi-Fi. So I think since the beginning of the pandemic, that's certainly been one area that on the policy front, I think it's presented a positive opportunity for the state to move into the 21st century with broadband. And two other ones I know that we all worked on this call was affordable housing and childcare, two issues that the Speaker of the House, Ryan Fecto, really spearheaded with his legislation to address affordable housing, and $12 million being in the budget for early childcare, workforce development, two huge issues where there were some positive developments on policies that were exacerbated from the pandemic.
Linda, do you have issues that perhaps the pandemic added to its sense of urgency?
Not really. No, not really. I mean, the only thing I would say is, in the pandemic, the state has realized an enormous amount of revenue during this time, last couple of years. And that's a lot of due to the state sales tax. And the thought is a lot of folks are at home, they're working at home, they're spending more online. And it's going to be interesting to see over the next year or so what happens as more people transition to the workplace. What happens to those revenue line items, because you've seen an enormous amount. And as you know, in the state budget, the governor and the legislature just passed the supplemental. They're giving back, $850 checks to over 800,000 Mainers. So it's going to be interesting to see if those revenue figures hold up or if they're going to go, slightly down. So.
Yeah, I want to circle back with each of you, and we've touched upon the process. The process probably created an even greater challenge for us, a process that we were not accustomed to, and that we didn't have that close contact that's part of our process here at the state chamber, but unless it was the last couple of weeks. But Peter, when you think of the process, identify what you thought was the biggest handicap. We know that it offered, for those of us who came from far reaches of our state, an opportunity to not have to travel, but to participate in committees. We'll take that as a positive, a given, and it may be with us going forward. But in terms of its handicap, speak to that.
Well, you're exactly right, Dana, in terms of the positive. I couldn't agree with you more. I guess I just put it in this way. Roughly every election cycle, about a third of the legislature is new. You have about 33% of legislators are brand new freshman legislators. In this freshman class, the virtual nature of conducting public policy is all they know. They didn't experience a committee room that's packed with people. They haven't had yes, it's one thing when you're in your home collecting, for a long public hearing. It's a different matter when you're in a committee room. You haven't been approached by lobbyists beforehand. You're not approached by lobbyists afterwards. They're not meeting as frequently in the third floor. So a lot of these folks don't really know what it's like to be lobbied, as we would ordinarily call it. and it's what they know. And so next session, when I think we all fully expect that we'll go back to, front-facing lobbying and meeting, whether it's full legislature or committees or whatever, it's just going to be a very different experience for those folks. And how they react to that is somewhat of an unknown. The only taste they really got of real lobbying is probably in the last 10 days of the legislative session, when they were up there and the lobbyists were really pushing around the issues, because it's the first opportunity we've had to, in some cases, have a face-to-face conversation with some of these folks.
Yeah. Ben, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say on the process, one of the things that made it very difficult in the Energy Committee is they saved a lot of work for the very, very end of session. The Energy Committee actually had to get one of the committees that needed to get a week-long extension to complete their work. And in their last week of committee work, they had to have over 15 work sessions on pieces of legislation. As we all know, with energy issues, they can be incredibly complex. There's a lot of moving parts. You have generation, transmission, there's just a lot of moving parts to energy policy. And the bills that they were debating in the final hours of committee work probably merited 3 or 4, maybe even 5 public hearings at times. And we just didn't see that. And I think, Peter stated some of the reasons why, because it's hard to do this type of work on Zoom. They were only meeting on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You had presentations at times that the committee needed to get from, the Public Advocate's Office or the Public Utilities Commission or the Governor's Energy Office. And that took away valuable time early in the session where they could have been working on some of the carryover bills. So, that I think is why you saw in a lot of the bills coming out of the Energy Committee, there were 3 reports, because they just needed to get these, the bills out of committee and to be on the Senate or House floor to be debated. And as you and Peter know from your years of experience at the State House, when a piece of legislation has 3 reports out of committee on it, that makes it very, very difficult for there to be a path forward. So hopefully in the future, that's something the committee can realize, if we are going to have some type of hybrid model or still do virtual, we don't know, but they need to, not save as much work on complex issues to the very, very end. And I know, Linda had some issues in tax committee with, various amendments being floated around and whatnot. So I'll let her speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very frustrating in the committee during the work sessions to have amendments proposed, and there was no opportunity to comment by the public. Normally, under normal circumstances, the committee would hold another 1 or 2 work sessions to allow that amendment to be distributed and to have an opportunity for the public to comment. And I worry going forward if, to your point, Peter, the newer legislators, if they think this is a normal process, it's kind of worrisome, because there should be an opportunity for the public to comment on those, and we had a number of those in tax, so it was troubling. But
yeah, I certainly wish we had more time, because the advocacy team here at the State Chamber has really done a remarkable job this year. They've not only did you represent the members exceedingly well and spoke to the value that each of you bring to your subject areas and as a result to our economy, but you also did it recognizing that coalitions are important. When you don't have that personal access, reaching out to local regional chambers, to other business associations, creating a coalition of effort, as well as those times that you did action alerts to members to get them to reach out to their legislator, all of that mattered. So as we leave the session, anticipating that the 9th will be a veto day principally with a few things remaining, all 3 of you should look back on this session with satisfaction, because I think you did a great job, not only for the chamber, but for the economy at large and for individual lives and livelihood of our Maine people. So like I said, we only touched the issues here today, but please know that everybody will be receiving a summary of this session, and it'll be coming to you shortly. When I say shortly, I don't mean in the next few days, but early June. And with that, you'll get a chance to go into detail in terms of what has occurred in this session, both good and bad. Next, I'd like to turn our attention to an organization that we've had for some time, but the person that I'm about to call on is the president of the Maine Economic Research Institute that has really lifted this organization into a new status. And I am pleased to welcome him, a member of the State Chamber staff. He's a finance director or financial person, as well as HR individual for our organization. Simon West is his name. He is the president of MERI, as we call it, the acronym. So Simon, tell us why what you just heard gives you reason to believe that there is an appropriate role to play with the MERI concept or initiative.
Good morning. Thank you, Dana. Well, I think the role for MERI and the appropriateness of it really fits into something that Peter Gore was speaking to just a few minutes ago with lobbying in the process of how the Maine State Chamber goes about getting better business outcomes each session, working with lawmakers, working with the administration, tracking the bills and making sure that the business community is taken care of as the session progresses. MERI has the same goal, to get good outcomes for the business community, but the approach is somewhat different. Rather than having a real focus on the legislation, our focus is on the legislator. And at the end of each session, we rate each legislator based on how they treated the business community and Maine's economy as a whole. And what this does is really pull back the curtain and give some honest transparency as to how each legislator performed. And it also creates, the really big point here is some accountability. So if you supported someone that ran on telling you they were going to do good things for business and for the economy, you can actually look at their track record and see if they really did that or not. And so the push to have better business outcomes is by holding legislators accountable for how they actually perform.
Yeah, and it's not, to put it into context, I mean, every business person that probably exists here or in any other state has a business plan, and they're evaluated in their efforts to really reach certain goals for each year or for a period of time. And they're held accountable if they do or if they don't. And it sounds to me like we are taking a business practice and applying it to those issues that help to move the economy forward or stand in the way of that progress.
Yes, that's absolutely true. One of the focal points of the criteria for looking at different types of legislation that lawmakers put forward is now the Maine's 10-year strategic plan. And that has three major overarching goals that are defined and they're measurable. And thanks to also an organization, the Maine Development Foundation, they have metrics that they rate every single year to show how we're advancing in certain economic areas. And thanks to the 10-year plan and MDF's measures, MERI is able to score a legislator based on how close or further did they bring us towards actualizing that 10-year plan. So just like any business would pick a goal to move towards and then measure their distance on an annual basis, we're able to do that on how each individual legislator worked to get us there.
Well, that's great. And that report you're anticipating will come out when?
I am hoping by the end of the second week of June, I will be able to put it into production.
Oh, that's great. Well, thanks, Simon. Really appreciate the work you're doing and how important it is actually for our members, but also for kind of a perspective on how well we're doing in this session when it comes to the economy and meeting the interests of both the employer and the employee, because one serves the other, and we appreciate the effort. Thanks for that. Now let's turn our attention to a regular that we have on as often as the schedule allows. That, of course, is Peter Van Allen, the editor of Mainebiz. And they have an edition that really speaks to one of the major issues that affect our workforce, affect our economy, and is a priority issue at the moment. Of course, that's housing. Peter?
Dana, thank you so much for having me on. Appreciate it as always. So you referred to our latest issue. This is the latest issue of Mainebiz that subscribers would get in their mailbox today. And we focused on the housing crisis, or housing crunch as we termed it in the publication. And basically what we did was Mainebiz does a lot of real estate coverage. So it's something that we've been looking at for a number of years, and we've been following how we've had a kind of an influx of out-of-state buyers, investors, and that sort of thing, and they're going after Maine real estate, Maine homes, and we are seeing cash buyers. We're seeing multiple bids, as many as 24 bids for different houses. There are people who are moving, who wanted to move here during the pandemic, from California, Texas, New York, you name the state. But there also now we've seen a lot of investors who are looking at short-term rental properties and that market who are snapping up properties, and it's creating a real crunch here. We're on the affordable housing side. We're seeing waiting lists for people to get into affordable housing. We're getting those reports from Avesta Housing, the largest builder of affordable housing. And basically we're in a crisis situation with this. It's not a new situation. We were seeing a housing crunch in development before the pandemic, but it's now become a full-blown crisis in Maine. Certainly one, if you're trying to find an apartment, an affordable house, any kind of, if you're trying to make any kind of movement in the home market right now. There has been an increase in building permits issued. That's good news, but we're still not we've only just kind of gotten to that level of like where we were in 2007. We're still not near the peak of the last housing boom. So we've got a ways to go. The good news is this is a solvable problem, and some of the new things that came out of the legislature were happening just as we were going to press with this issue. But this could ease up multifamily development of multifamily housing, accessory dwelling units, where someone owns a fair amount of property or house, and they build a smaller unit behind them. We could see additional tiny homes, which are, they're a niche in the market. That's not going to, greatly change things. In-law apartments, this kind of thing. And we also cast a net out just to ask people, what would you do? What do you think would be a good solution? One developer of affordable housing, Nathan Zanton, had suggested that any town or city of more than 5,000 people would look at where they could designate an area of the town for affordable housing. Mayor Levesque of Auburn has been very vocal and very out there about suggesting zoning changes and freeing up some of the restrictive zoning we have in places to allow for greater density of housing, as well as just being able to develop in some areas where we haven't seen much development in the past. So there's a lot going on with this, but I think the good news, Dana, is that there are also people who are looking at the solutions here.
Oh, I agree with you. I think that it is an issue that's evolved to a place where it's kind of reached that point in time when you sit back and you look at everything associated with housing, whether it's land use, whether it's zoning requirements, and you've touched upon both of those. And I think that when you look at, I'm going to identify it as Speaker Fecto's bill, but there was there was a coalition that put a number of those recommendations forward. And he and others spent an enormous amount of time reviewing what was put forward, modifying it, and trying to move this issue forward. I mean, every successful initiative begins at some point in some place and time. And I think that's how we look at, or that's how we at the State Chamber look at the bill that was put forward. I'd be interested in your reaction to it, because I think it's the beginning that causes all of us to look at those things surrounding housing availability as well as affordability and say, what do we need to do to make it work?
It's interesting, Dana, that you brought that up, because so House Speaker Ryan Fecteau, this issue that we did started to take shape during the MERI conference, the big real estate and developers conference earlier in the year. And House Speaker Fecteau had a very compelling story, and he talked about growing up in affordable housing in Biddeford and how important it was. I think I don't remember all the details, but I remember his mom having to move into this kind of affordable housing in Biddeford, and how crucial that was to his development, being able to have a roof over their heads and nice housing. And he had a very compelling argument for it. And I think, I guess in Augusta, they felt that way too. So it's good that some of the stuff is starting to take root here.
Yeah, I agree. And I appreciate Mainebiz bringing this forward in a dedicated edition that provides for us a perspective that's pretty inclusive and complete in its look at this critical issue. So once again, Peter, I thank you and invite you back any week and every week, so long as your schedule allows.
Good talking with you.
Thank you. Actually, the takeaway for this week, knowing that this is our 50th episode, really begins with acknowledging and appreciating all of the guests that we've had on in these 50 shows. It's amazing when you look at the quality of those that have participated with us. So grateful. And they provided us great insight and perspective into the issues for which they are working on or the people they're working with. So I begin by thanking them. And this week, as our program has shared with you, a week from now, the 130th session of the Maine Legislature, we anticipate will have come to a close. Of course, I'm speaking of May the 9th. And with the words of the legislature sine die, the second session will be behind us. I said that's anticipated because what we have on the 9th, there are a few bills that need to be signed by the governor or vetoed by the governor within the 10 days of her receipt. If they're vetoed, of course, that is the purpose of May 9th. They go back to the legislature for their either they sustain the veto or they override it with that 2/3 vote. Or perhaps, in the case that we are aware of, she may let them go into become law without her signature. Whatever the case may be, as we look to this session, there's some takeaways. You've heard a lot already by our advocacy team, as was because they pretty clearly indicated that it was marked by a lot of challenges in terms of policy, but also in process. The pandemic perhaps added to some of that in terms of what got presented, but clearly they were challenges. Were they very different from the past? No, probably not. They were different perhaps in their topic, but there's always challenges in every single session. The pandemic affected legislation as it did our lives and the livelihood. There's no question about that. And we saw that in process in particular, where committee meetings were held by Zoom. And that's great if you're traveling from Presque Isle or other places that may be far away and you come to Augusta, and perhaps time is limited, so you get 3 minutes to testify. With Zoom, you may still have the 3 minutes, but you do not have to travel as far and perhaps spend a day to doing it. And as the team also pointed out, we live by access to legislators, to build those relationships, to develop that trust so that they can rely upon us to be straightforward and honest with them. Yeah, that was the session this time. It was challenging, both in process, but also in the policy questions before our state. But like most sessions, in fact, in my experience, all sessions, there's always something positive that comes out of it. There's always opportunities that wasn't there before the session had begun. I'll talk about just a couple of those. Think of the Maine spaceport that was passed, that puts Maine on the map when it comes to those small satellite opportunities. It's innovation in its purest form. At Brunswick Landing, at Loring Air Force Base in Midcoast, Maine, the door has just been opened for this opportunity, and we're grateful that the legislature took action on this promising concept. The other was the federal funds that were available because of the pandemic came home to support our state as well. The governor's jobs and rescue plan, recovery plan, I should say, proved to be very, very promising. A lot of businesses struggled, a lot of individuals had unmet needs, and the money that was put forward to help both the people as well as businesses proved their worth. And what also was evident in a very positive way was how the Appropriations Committee of the legislature took this issue on. And at the end of the day, their actions were approved unanimously. And it saw the same fate, almost unanimous, in the legislature's final approval. That's remarkable considering the challenges before us, to think that they came out with that strong bipartisan effort. They are to be committed. Yeah, and even studies. Studies are often overlooked in terms of their value, but it's always nice to know all of the issues surrounding a topic before decisions are made. You've heard this term, ready, aim, fire. We want to make sure it's not ready, fire, aim. And studies help us to understand it. They pointed out, the staff did at least, a couple of areas that we can look forward to next session when the reports, the studies are complete. And I want to pick up on what the staff also said. In 2019, before the pandemic, 1,300 people came together in Maine, put forth a 10-year strategic plan. Boy, did that ever prove its worth during this legislative session of the 130th. Think about it. They focused on the workforce challenge and on innovation as their two foundational features of that. What could be more promising to help us address issues as well as map the future? It also encouraged and promoted investments in housing, in childcare, in broadband, in transportation. And in these 2 years, I cannot think of investments that are more worthy. So you see, when we look back on the session, it's easy to focus on the challenges before us. Shame on us if we don't also take a look at the opportunities that are positive. Because as one speaker reminded me years ago, don't judge us by what gets presented early on in the session. Judge us by what gets passed. In that respect, I not only thank our staff for doing an incredible job in working with local and regional chambers and with other coalitions. Their job, their good work was reflected in this session. And the opportunities are as important as some of the issues that we were able to defeat. So with that, I thank all of you for being with us one more week. And as we usually say as we close out the show, in a world where you can be anything, be kind. Be kind to yourself and be kind to one another. And until this time next week, have a wonderful few days, and we'll see you right back here on the Maine Take.